This idea started last year as just a sketch on my notepad, but the more I thought about it, the more I knew I had to make it. So I scoured the internet for the dimensions of a tape. If you've noticed in any of my past builds, I put a lot of focus on dimension scaling properly. And this one had a lot of dimensions on a lot of layers and a lot of different cut paths. The way I decided to attack this thing was to break it down in three ways: the body, the inside, and the legs. The obvious first step is the body. This is what everything else is going to be based around. I decided the two mediums on this project would be Baltic birch plywood and walnut. I chose these because I thought they would look good together. So now, let's build a cassette tape coffee table. You know, on projects where some ideas are good ideas, this isn't exactly one of those. I had told myself right before this that I needed to change the bit out, and then I went and did something else. I just shook it off and did a little extra sanding, but a storm was truly brewing. I was really getting ahead of this. Measure twice, cut once. Yeah, I cut it backwards. So, lucky for me, I was able to salvage these and not have to recut. These were kind of tricky to sand, but sandpaper wrapped around a scrap piece of thin wood worked perfect. After picking out a few boards that looked like they'd work, it was time to process some more lumber. I was having the worst time aligning things on this project. I felt like I was nickel and diming myself to death. But at this point, I wasn't going to lose any sleep over it, fix the problem, and move on. As you'll be able to see watching this, at times I had multiple parts of this going on. So I tried to arrange it in the video as best I could, but if it kind of bounces back and forth a few times, you'll know why. The jigsaw worked pretty well on this compared to the plywood. Now I'll pass with the trim bit to get rid of the tabs. And then to cut off the piece I glued on. The Onefinity dropped a little nugget on me here, and you can see where it cut a file that I didn't even load in. But that's going to be on the inside where it won't be seen, so I'll move on. Another byproduct of my haste was the bottom of this. This was actually about a 1/16 of an inch short, but wasn't all the way across, so I decided to cut an 1/8 off and just make the whole thing even. I didn't want to risk freehanding this, so I decided to make a template. I took small passes on these and everything was going fine. But this is a prime example of why you mark the sides you don't want to cut. See if you can see the mistake here. This is a pretty quick fix. It's going on the bottom, so it's not that big of a deal. But I can tell you, it's something that would be easily avoided had I marked it. When I designed this up, I made sure that I added alignment holes. This made it a lot easier to put this thing together. Although I did forget to highlight a few holes for the cut pass, but that's okay. So let's start assembling. Where the sides on this are pretty easy to align, the top of this has to be perfectly centered. I'll drop a brief history lesson here. For those too young to remember this, these two top cutouts were the difference between whether you could record on the cassette or not. So in order to record over one that didn't have the tabs, we used to put tape over it, and sometimes would stuff paper wads in them. It was at this point where I realized the quality on this Lazy Susan, they are not going to be that good. Now, the original cassettes with the reels, there wasn't a lot of precision in them anyway. But for this, for me to run a belt between them, I kind of wanted them to be symmetrical. They were kind of oval. And then to throw salt on the wound, the screws that I had kept on snapping off. Oh, son of a... It was at this point that I realized I needed to be able to center these two circles on themselves. With these hollowed out, there was no way to go from the center. So I made this jig with two dowel rods that allows it to spin on the outside. That way you can center from the outside of the circle. It worked perfect. I really couldn't think of a better way to do this. I didn't want to put them on the spindle sander and risk taking off too much, so this piece of PVC with sandpaper stuck to it, it worked pretty good. Now we're definitely moving into territory I've never touched. So what you're going to see for the next few minutes is me totally winging it. I got lucky and the teeth almost align when pulling this around. If it skips a tooth every once in a while, it's not that big of a deal. I didn't want these tabs to be seen, so I needed to go ahead and lob these off of here. This isn't the best way to do it. It did get the job done. You just have to be careful. I had a few reservations about gluing this straight onto the plywood, but the movement would be negligible, so I just went with it. I did my best to center these egg-shaped rollers. You don't really notice the difference on the outside. It's only the play in the belt that you actually notice it. Now these two parts I did worry a little more about wood movement. So I actually glued these on the end slightly and then make brackets that kind of sandwich them in. It's here you can see why I removed the tabs. Some better Lazy Susans would probably work, but you still need to be able to access the screws from the back side. At this point, I had started doing some research on how to glue these belts together, and it looked like they just used super glue and then some kind of backer, so that's exactly what I did. And for all intents and purposes, it worked fine. I have to admit, the moment of truth was pretty satisfying. But this is where it really hit that I was going to have a really special tensioner on this, and that this was one of about half a dozen side quests in this project. So my dad did tool and die work after the Navy, and these number and letter punches have been sitting around in the shop for quite some time. This was the perfect use for them because these weren't interchangeable. They were close, but they weren't. I tried to make sure to put finish on everything as soon as that step was done. That way I didn't have to put things together, take them back apart, etc., etc. Plus I wanted them fully covered. If I did them when assembled, I'd only be able to get the visible parts. I didn't actually get a good shot of these, but here they are holding this in place. When I first started this project, I originally was going to glue the top together. The further I got into this, I began to realize it would make more sense to be able to disassemble the top in case something went wrong with the belts inside. Had I thought about this earlier, I could have glued the sides into the top and screwed into the side walls from the bottom up. This would have eliminated the whole step you are seeing. I'm adding these because I didn't want to screw into the 1/2-inch ply on the top of this. That would have been a really tight tolerance to hit and a risk I wasn't willing to take. Here I added some spacers and screwed in from the bottom. When I get ready to glue this to the top, it needs to be aligned perfectly in order for this to work. Everything was going smooth. The plan seemed flawless until, remember those brackets I showed you earlier in the middle of the top? Well, I had to do some modifying. Now all I had to do was channel my inner Michael Ohm and make some pattern plywood. Okay, so it's not exactly pattern plywood, but it kinda is. This was another major component of the aesthetic of this build. If these don't align, it's not going to look like a tape. Also, with me changing the design, these are either going to have to stick to the top or the bottom when it separates. So I had to think this through at the same time. My plan was pretty simple. I would just add dowels for alignment pins. Once everything was aligned, I just glued one side and clamped them together. Now all that was left for the bottom was gluing this piece on. Since functionally the outside was complete, I decided to put finish on the inside and give it a test fit. One thing I did notice here is that my CNC cut this a little out of square, about a 32nd over 32 inches, which is not that big of a deal, but since they were cut the same way and then one was flipped, it actually made it about a 16th off. So I had to do a little work to get this straightened up. If I would have thought about it, I would have mirrored the top and bottom cuts on the CNC. That way, if they were out of square just a little bit, it would have been on the same plane. As you can understand, I wasn't about to get my fingers anywhere near this. These were going to be small parts with a 60-degree angle on every side. It's best to just take my time. At this point, I was getting pretty excited to put the finish on this. I couldn't wait to see what it would look like. I just kept having this sneaking suspicion that I was forgetting something. Oh yeah, I was supposed to glue these on before I put the finish on. So I had to sand the finish off, then glue it on, and then put some more finish on. This part of the build literally took me 2 weeks to come up with. I would come up with a design and it wouldn't work. I would come up with another design and I didn't like it. Finally, I came back to the original design and I found the right dimensions for it. So after I drew it up, it was time to put it in Cut 2D and get this started. As you'll see here, I did the legs 2 different ways. One, I made a template on the CNC and then cut the rest on the bandsaw. Used double-sided tape to put them together and routed them out. The other way, I just straight cut them on the CNC. I needed to be as efficient as I possibly could on this because I had a lot of things going on while I was doing this project. Every time something was cutting, I was drawing something out for this project. Since I bought the new saw stop, I don't have a jig to hold anything with, so at the same time I cut these, I had to make me a jig. And while I was at it, I thought it would be perfect to use Cut 2D to lay these out. These linked up perfectly. All I had to do was replicate the picture, slide them through the saw, and get perfect cuts every time. I couldn't ask for a better way to do this. So making these exact fixtures to hold this is the way. While working on this, I started having this idea bouncing through my head. What if I were to continue the Baltic birch theme in the legs? On paper, it seemed like it might be too much, but when I saw them side by side, I knew it had to be done. Now I'm going to get real about this part. My clamping was out of this world on these, and I don't mean that in a good way. As I progressed with these, I kind of went more simple, and that way worked a lot better. So sometimes, and in this case, simple is better. This one had the slimmest of a gap in it, so I cut a little wedge type sliver and put this in here. I think a lot of times this simple solution gets overlooked for filling a gap like that. This worked so good you couldn't even tell it existed. I needed this flushed, so I didn't want to risk using a chisel. I just made this little fixture to get it perfectly flat. I figured the best way to do these was to lay the tape where I wanted it, drill holes in it, then set the legs on, push the bit through so that I would know where they aligned, and then drill into the leg. When I was sure this was going to work, I just repeated the process. My only issue on these is that they weren't perfectly square. Instead of a 90, they were about a 89. One thing about doing legs like this, if you wanted to put a chamfer or bevel on the inside of these, you would have to do it before you assembled them. Otherwise, your router wouldn't fit down in there. Since I freehanded these, they all needed a number punch too. This part of the build is where you see that light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not actually an oncoming train, or so I thought. But we'll get to that later. Since this table had never been together as a whole, I decided to do one more test fit before I put armor seal on everything. Even though I knew I was going to take this back apart, I knew I wasn't going to put armor seal on the inside, so it made sense to go ahead and put the rails in. As this project continued on, I actually found some better looking Lazy Susans. I haven't tried them yet, but did manage to find some that could possibly fit in the parameters of this. But since everything was built around these, there was no need for me to change them mid-process. Now we arrive at the last little bump in the road. I didn't even think about the leg screw interrupting the top on this. It's a good thing I test fit it. I would have hated to have already applied the finish and risk damaging it while I'm fixing my mistake. I did a lot of research to do this table. It also took quite a bit of time to design it and a whole lot of time to build it. This has been a fun project, but since it spanned over a couple months, I was really feeling the urge to get this done. I couldn't be more satisfied when I saw how this was coming together. Now the only thing left to do was to add my logo. This right here is a fine example of trying to do too much too fast. It took me a little while to clean this up, but I managed to get it done without having to recut it. I sprayed a little lacquer on it and then used CA glue to attach it to the bottom. I actually like the way this looks. I may have to just do a batch of these so I can stick them on whatever. So we finally arrive at this point, the reveal. So I did quite a few things that I wasn't familiar with in this build. I picked up a few new tools to get things done. Learned a little more about some software I had. And really took the time to try to design this thing out to where it went together flawlessly. Even though I had a few hiccups here and there, I'd say the project was overall a success. And some of the projects I have coming up after this are really going to push my ability, design and build. I really don't think you're going to want to miss these upcoming projects, so if you made it this far in the video, like and subscribe.